Hello, I'm David Dipple. This is 1316 Trigonometry, Lone Star College. We're dealing with Section 3, Definitions of Trigonometry Functions and Triangles. We first need to look at some definitions. That is, if you have an angle in your triangle, if you go farthest away from it, that's called opposite. If you go right next to it, that's called adjacent. And then the longest side is the hypotenuse. Now, if you look at some fractions, we're going to call sine, S-I-N, theta, is going to be the opposite number, opposite side, whatever that is, divided by the value of the hypotenuse. The fraction for cosine is going to be adjacent, which is next to the angle, hypotenuse. And then tangent is the opposite side divided by the adjacent side, or the sine divided by the cosine. Now we have some other functions to deal with. These are the reciprocal functions. If you just flip each of these over, secant is if you flip over cosine. So if it starts with a C, flip over cosine, so you get hypotenuse and adjacent. Cosecant is if you flip over sine, which is the opposite, so it's hypotenuse opposite. Cotangent is if you flip over tangent, which is adjacent divided by opposite. Now, if we have a triangle with a 5 and a 2, we'll use a Pythagorean. 5 squared is 25. 2 squared is 4. That makes 29. So your hypotenuse is the square root of that, which is the square root of 29. Sine was opposite over hypotenuse. Here's my angle theta. Opposite is 5. Hypotenuse is 29. Cosine is adjacent. Next to theta is 2. Hypotenuse is 29. So it's 2 over 29. Tangent is opposite, 5. Adjacent, 2. That's 5 over 2. Remember, secant was when we flipped over cosine. Again, if it starts with an S, it's reciprocal of cosine. C's and S's go together. So just flip over this 2 29ths. Gives you square root of 29 over 2. Cosecant, so if you flip over sine, since it starts with a C, it's the reciprocal of the S function, so cosecant is the square root of 29 over 5. Cotangent goes with the tangent function, flip it over, 2 over 5. Okay, another option, we have a 2 opposite our C. Angle B is our right angle, 7 is our hypotenuse. So this side down here is going to be 49 when you square 7, minus 2 squared, which is 4. Take the square root, gives you the square root of 45. Now if we look at A, sine of A, opposite is 45. Hypotenuse is 7, so square root of 45 over 7. Cosine of A, if you look at A, cosine next to it is adjacent, 2. Hypotenuse 7. Tangent is opposite, the square root of 45. Adjacent, 2. Square root of 45 over 2. Now, when we're looking at secant of C, that's going to be cosine flipped over, except we're looking at C. So here's C. Cosine deals with the 45 and the 7, so it's going to be 7 over 45. Cosecant of C, that's going to deal with the sine, which is the 2 and the 7, flipped over makes it 7 over 2. Cotangent of C is the 2 and the 45, flipped over is 45, square root of 45 over 2. So you need to know what those ratios are, you need to get those memorized. Okay, finding some exact values. If I give you a 60-degree angle, earlier we memorized some things. This 1, we double to get the hypotenuse, which makes 2. We put the square root of 3 to get the vertical component. So that's 2 and the square root of 3. Now sine of 30. 30 degrees is up here at A. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, which is 1/2. Cosine of the 30 is adjacent, square root of 3. Hypotenuse 2. Sine of 60 is opposite over the hypotenuse. And cosine of 60 is adjacent 1 over the hypotenuse 2, well, to 1/2. You just have to memorize opposite over adjacent, opposite over hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, and opposite over adjacent for tangent. You've got to memorize those. Okay, suppose we have a 45 right triangle. Sine of 45 is going to be opposite over hypotenuse. We need this number here. And if you remember back to the 45, you put a square root of 2 next to whatever your side is. So it's 1 square root of 2. Now the sine of 45 is opposite over hypotenuse, which is 1 over the square root of 2. And we'll rationalize that later, which gives us square root of 2 over 2. Cosine of 45 is adjacent over hypotenuse, which is 1 over the square root of 2. And if we rationalize it, square root of 2 over 2. We'll use the square root of 2 over 2 notation later again, so that's the best one to memorize. Tangent of 45 is opposite 1, adjacent 1, which is 1. So we now have sine, cosine, and tangent of 45, and those do need to be memorized also. So we need to memorize some of these values. Write them down, make flashcards, whatever you need to do, but you need to get these memorized. Okay, suppose we have a 60-degree angle. Our 72, remember what do we do to get to H? And what do we get to A? Now we can check that with some of the information we just had. Okay, if we want to find the cosine of 60, cosine of 60 is going to be cosine adjacent 72 over H. Now we memorized a little while ago cosine of 60 was 1/2 is 72 over H. If we solve that, you get H is 144. Multiply this side by H, multiply both sides by 2, and it gives you 144. Now, we could have used our memorized note information from before. 72, you double it to get to hypotenuse, which is the 144. Sine of 60 is opposite over hypotenuse, A over H. Well, we know what H is, and we know what the sine of 60 is. Sine of 60 was the square root of 3 over 2. A over 44, 144, because that's what H is. And again, if you solve this one, 2 times A is 144 times the square root of 3, divided by 2 is 72 square root of 3. And that is the same pattern we had earlier. 72 goes with the A. Now, if you have a point in space, 0, 0 being the origin, that's one point on your triangle. If you go over x distance and up y distance, the point you get out here is xy. The distance from 0, 0 out to that point we're going to call r. And you can use the Pythagorean theorem. R is equal to the square root of x squared plus y squared. Sine of theta, the sine is going to be opposite over the hypotenuse, which is y over r. Cosine is going to be y, or x over r rather, adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent is going to be opposite, which is y over adjacent, which is x. So if they give you a point in space, you can just take the y value with the r value, and r being Pythagorean theorem generates it, x squared plus y squared, and take the square root. Secant is cosine flipped over, r over x. Cosecant is sine flipped over, so r over y. And cotangent, that's a mistake. Cotangent is tangent flipped over, should be x over y, not y over r. So that's a mistake. Okay, suppose we want to find all trig functions for the point -3, -2. Going back to our definitions we just had, we need to draw a triangle so we can get some other numbers. -3 in the x direction goes, if we start at 0, 0, goes -3. -2 in the y direction goes down 2, so here's our point, -3, -2. Here's our angle. Pythagorean theorem is 9 plus 4 makes 13, so the hypotenuse is square root of 13. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. That's how we find our radius. We just did that. Sine is opposite negative 2 over hypotenuse, square root of 13. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, negative 3/13. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, which will turn out to be negative 2 over negative 3, or 2/3. Now, so to win all 6 trig functions, you can take the reciprocals of each of those. Secant is cosine flipped over, and I put the negative on the top. Cosecant is sine flipped over, 13 over negative 2, or negative square root of 13 over 2. And tangent, when you find its reciprocal, you get 3 over 2. Now the final thing you need to be able to do is use a calculator. So if you'll turn on a graphing calculator, make sure your mode, push mode, which is second line, second column, and make sure it is set for degrees. There are some other options. You have radians, you have degrees. Make sure it's on degrees, because we're looking for a degree. You just simply push the sine key, 25 degrees. You'll get that answer. Push the cosine key. Negative is the minus down near the enter key. 42, get that answer. If you type all of these in, the correct answers should be sine of 25 is 0.4226. Cosine of negative 42 is 0.7431. Tangent is 9325. It's negative. To get secant, there is no secant key on a graphing calculator. You just take 1 divided by cosine, because that's the definition of secant. So it's 1 divided by cosine of 33 was 1.1923. Cosecant, same thing with a sine. And cotangent, same thing with tangent. So to find the reciprocal functions, just type in 1 divided by your trig function with your angle. Now if you're looking at the positive and negative components of sine and cosine, cosine is the first value in a point because it has x in it. Sine is the second value because it has y in it. So in the first quadrant, since your radius is always positive, you're always going out. In the first quadrant, cosine is positive, that's the first number, and the second number is positive, so sine is positive. In the second quadrant, the first numerical value is negative, so cosine is negative. The second one is positive, so sine is positive. The third quadrant, they're both negative, cosine and sine. In the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive and sine is negative. So you need to memorize those. And it's just the fact that cosine is related to x, sine is related to y. So the x component is your cosine and the y component is your sine. Then just to reinforce that, cosine is your x, sine is the y, so your point is always cosine comma sine. Now, just to practice this, suppose we want to find sine in the second or in the third quadrant. You can just redraw the graph or think in the third quadrant they're both negative, so sine would have to be negative. Tangent is sine and cosine together, so in the second quadrant you have a positive and negative together, that makes negative. Secant is the cosine component, which is the first number. In the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. Now if it says what quadrants is sine going to be possibly 2/5 positive, well, to get sine positive, the second number has to be positive, which is the first quadrant and the second quadrant. Now with secant, which is the cosine, is negative, cosine is negative when you go left, which is the second and third quadrants. Cotangent is when sine and cosine, since it's negative, are different. So you have a plus and a minus, which happens in the second and the fourth. Now, that's everything that's covered in section 3 of trigonometry. So if you need more information on Section 4, go ahead and go on that. Make sure you go into WebAssign and work through Section 3.